Hello everyone, my name is Ryan Baxter and I'm a developer advocate for Bluemix at IBM. And I'm back with the second part of our video on hybrid clouds. In the first part we have created our cloud integration add-on in Bluemix, and we've installed and set up the secure connector on our server containing our REST APIs. And now we're ready to actually create the connection between the cast iron live service and the REST APIs that are behind our firewall. So you can see that we have our to-do API secure connector actually running. It's up and running as we left it off in our last video. But in order to create the connection between the cast iron live service and our server REST APIs behind the firewall, we need to use a tool called Cast Iron Live Studio. Cast Iron Live Studio is a free download which you can get from Fix Central, IBM's Fix Central. And you want to download WebSphere Cast Iron Studio 7.0.0.1. And I'll include the link to this in the description of the video. But you can see we have the WebSphere Cast Iron Live Studio 7.0.0.1 images, which you can download from Fix Central. So this is the thing you actually want to download. I already have it downloaded and installed, so once you have it installed, you can open up Cast Iron Studio. The one thing to note is that I'm pretty sure that this only runs on Windows. It doesn't run on Mac or Linux, so you have to use a Windows machine in order to do your create what's called your orchestrations. So to get started, we're going to create a project here, and we're going to call it to-dos. Click OK. And this is going to create your first orchestration. Now, an orchestration is essentially the steps that need to happen in order to get and retrieve data from your REST API that's behind your firewall. So the first thing in doing that is setting up a couple of endpoints. You need to set up two endpoints. One endpoint that is the endpoint in Cast Iron Live, which your Bluemix application will be talking to. And the other endpoint is the application which is running your REST APIs, the URL to that application. So you can see at the top here we can create a new endpoint. It's this green circular button here. We'll click on that, and then there's a number of options, but you want to select HTTP since we're doing REST here. And the first endpoint we're going to create is for Cast Iron Live. We'll just check the box here, configure for WebSphere Cast Iron Live, and it automatically fills in the information for Cast Iron Live. And that's pretty much it. That's all you need to do for this endpoint. So we'll save that. Okay, now we need to create a second HTTP endpoint that points to our server running our REST application. So we're going to create another HTTP endpoint. And this one's going to be a remote server, and it's going to point to our server running our REST API. So I'm just going to copy that server name just to make sure that we get it right. I'm going to copy this here, which is etc203. And we'll go back to our Windows VM and paste in that URL. Just make sure that's right. Yep, that looks right. And there's no authentication. We don't need to enter any of that. It's not using HTTPS. But we do need to tell it that it is an endpoint that runs behind the firewall, and what the secure connector name is. Now, the secure connector name is the name we gave our secure connector in WebSphere Cast Iron Live. So we'll just copy this name here, and we will paste that down in here. And then if you want, you can click Test Connection, and it should actually tell that it was successful. And we should probably give these some more meaningful names. So the HTTP one is our Cast Iron Live endpoint, and this one is our to-do endpoint. It's called to-do. Okay, so we have our two endpoints created, and now we can use those within our orchestration. So to use them, you basically drag and drop them into the orchestration. So the first thing you want to do is drag and drop the cast iron live orchestration, and you're going to create a receive request and insert that into your orchestration. Now the receive request is basically saying to start this orchestration, there's going to be a request coming into cast iron live. And once the request comes into cast iron live, what do we want it to do? Well, we want it to call one of our REST APIs on our server behind the firewall. So we're going to drag over our to-do HTTP endpoint as the next piece of our orchestration, and we're going to want it to make a GET request to a specific endpoint on our REST server, a REST application. So we're going to select GET request, and once we make that GET request, we want to respond with that information back to the cast iron live endpoint. So we're going to drag and drop the cast iron live endpoint again to our orchestration, and we're going to say send response, and that's going to send a response back to our Bluemix application, which is calling the cast iron live endpoint. So now we need to configure these a little bit. So basically what we've done here is said from cast iron live there's going to be a request coming in. That request should make a GET request to our to-do REST API on our server behind our firewall, and when that responds back, we should take the information it responds back and send it back to cast iron live to respond back to the Bluemix application. So first, let's configure our receive request. You want to make sure that it's using the right endpoint, which is cast iron live, which is right. You want to configure the URL that is going to be used in cast iron live to call this endpoint. So this is going to be actually the URL, the public URL that's exposed to the public internet in the cloud. So we're going to name this URL API/to-do get/to-do. So this is something you can come up with and create on your own. So this is what I decided to call our API in the cloud. It's only going to accept GET methods, so we're just going to check that off. And that is it. Oh, actually, we need to check off requires reply as well, since this does require a reply. We don't need request headers, and we don't need to do anything in the map outputs field yet for this GET request. So let's move on to the GET request that's going to be calling our REST API behind the firewall. Again, make sure that your endpoint is configured properly, it's pointing to the right endpoint. And in the configure section, you want to make sure that it's going to call the right REST endpoint to get the to-dos. So for this REST endpoint, I want to get all to-dos. So that's going to be our the endpoint we were showing in the previous video. So everything after the host name is what you want. So we're going to take all that and paste that here. And so this is the endpoint we want to call on our server behind the firewall to get all to-dos. It's going to respond with text, it's not going to respond with binary. So that's all we have to do in the configure portion. We want to select the response headers and make sure that we include predefined standard headers. So these are pretty much your standard HTTP headers that are going to come back. And there's nothing for the inputs, but there is stuff we need to do in the outputs here. So the outputs basically says, what do you want to take from the response back that we get from calling the REST API on the server behind the firewall? What do you want? What data you want to take from that response and communicate back to the REST API in the public cloud? So you need to do some mapping here, and it's basically drag and drop. But we're going to map a couple of the standard fields here. Most importantly, we want to know the content length, the content type. We also want to know the response code, right? We want to know whether it was a successful response, a failure, some kind of error. And we want to know the body as well, because the body contains all the to-dos, the JSON array of to-dos. So we need to create some parameters to store that data in. So to do that, you click Select Outputs, and you click New, and then you, for example, for the content length, we're going to make that a string, and click Next, and look at the name, content length, finish. And then for content type, we're going to also make that a string. Click next. Insert content type. Finish. And then what we also had body that we needed, so we're going to make that string as well. And we'll give that the name body. And then we also had response code, and that's actually an integer, so we'll select int. We'll give the name response code. And then the last one was response message, I believe. So that's going to be a string as well. And do that. Okay. So now we've created our orchestration variables to store this data in, and we'll click OK. Actually, we need to go back and include all these, just the response message. And now we can start mapping things over. So let's give ourselves a little bit more room here. So response message gets mapped to the response message variable. So just drag and drop the two. Response code maps to the response code variable. The body responds to the body variable. The content type responds to the content type. Content length goes to content length. And you can create variables for these others if you want. They're not particularly important in our case, but you can create variables for all these and store everything that you get back from the response into variables if you want. So we've mapped our outputs to variables, so now that they're stored in variables, we can use these variables in our response, in our send response back to cast iron live. So the only thing we want to do here is make sure that we include predefined standard headers in the response headers back from cast iron live, just like we did from the GET request. And then if we go to map inputs, we're going to do something very similar, but now we're going to take the values that are in our variables and map them to the response back from cast iron live. So we'll select inputs here, and we're going to, again, select all our inputs and start mapping things. So content length goes to content length, content type goes to content type, body goes to body, and response code goes to response code, and response message also to response message. Okay, so that's about it. That's what it took to create an orchestration to do our GET request and get all of our to-dos. And once we're done creating this orchestration, we can go ahead and save it, and we want to export it so we can import it into cast iron live. So we're going to export the project, and I'm going to export it to my desktop and call it todos.par, and I'm going to overwrite the existing one that's already there, and it was successfully exported. So now we can go back to cast iron live, and what we want to do is click on the repository field here in the development tab. So click on repository, and then click upload project, and then you're going to select that .par file that you just exported from Cast Iron Live Studio, and here's the one we just exported. And click open, click upload, and once the project is uploaded, you need to deploy it. So you can click the green button here to deploy that project. And you should see that it's now running. So that's a very simple way to create an orchestration. And this was a very simple orchestration because it's just doing a GET request. You can also create more complex orchestrations for things like, say, a put request or a post request, right? So why don't we take a quick look at what that looks like. So to do an orchestration for a put or a post that has a body that comes along with it. So for example, if we want to create a new to-do, the new to-do, the JSON for the new to-do that we want to create goes in the post body. So we need to somehow map the post body that's coming in from Cast Iron Live to a post request that's going to our internal server, and then we're sending a response just like we did before. So to do something like that, we'll create a new orchestration here. And we're going to start off the same way we did before. We're going to drag and drop the Cast Iron Live endpoint, and it's going to be a receive request. Then we are going to want to make let's say in this case, a put request to our server running behind the firewall. And then we're going to respond back to Cast Iron Live with our server behind the firewall. We're going to click the send response. So this is what our orchestration looks like this time. It looks pretty much the same, the only difference being that this is a put request as opposed to a get request. We still need to go through some configuration here. So again, we need to configure the host name for the receive request, and we'll just kind of copy some information here since some of this is going to be the same. I'm sorry, it's not the host name, it's the endpoint we want to use. And we can actually use the same endpoint that we used before in the put request, except this time we're going to change the method to be put only. In this case, actually, the other thing we're going to do here is we're also going to pass along the ID of the to-do that we want to update. So we're going to create a variable, and the way you create a variable is using these curly braces. So curly brace ID, curly brace. And this goes, you'll now see that their path parameters show up here. The ID path parameter that we just created shows up here in our map output. So this is very useful because we need to take the map outputs, basically the ID that we have here, and also the body that gets sent here, and map it into variables because we're going to use this in the put request we made here. Whereas before with the get request, we didn't have to use any of those variables, right? Because we're just making a get request, there's nothing to actually pass along. There was no path parameters, there was no body actually passed along. But in the put request, there could be some path parameters, and there's going to be a body as well. So we need to pass these along. So in our map outputs for our receive request, we're going to select outputs. We're going to go through some of the similar process we had before. We're going to create a new string that is the ID, to store the ID from the path parameter. We're going to create a new string that is the body. So we're going to call it the input body. And click finish. And then we're going to add these two variables to our orchestration, and we're just going to map these over. So we're going to map that the ID goes to the ID, and that the body goes to the body. Okay. So now we're done with our receive request. We need to go to our put request. And again, here we're going to do some of the similar configuration to our get request, where it's still the same actual path that we're going to put to. But again, this put path also contains, and this is the server behind our firewall, remember, this also contains the ID. So we're going to map the ID that we got from our receive request to this path parameter in our put request that's going to the server behind the firewall. So to do that, we're going to, again, make sure in our response headers we include the predefined response headers. In our map inputs, we are going to select the ID in input body. Map those to the ID and the other input body here. So these inputs basically say, when you make the request to our server behind the firewall, include this ID in the path parameter, include this body in the put body that you're going to send to our server behind the firewall. Okay. In our outputs, we want to do something very similar, that actually the same exact thing we did from before. We want to map the content length, the content type, the response code, the body, and the response header, the response message, all are outputs that we want to map. So we're going to create them just like we did in our get request. Okay, so we're going to include all these in our orchestration variables, and we're going to do the same mappings that we did before for the get request. So content length goes to content length, content type goes to content type, and response body goes to body, and response code goes to response code, and response message goes to response message. All right, so we have our inputs and outputs configured. Okay, so I noticed that our send response in the configure thing, it doesn't have a reply, our reply to specified. We have a nice big icon here warning us about that. And I just realized that the reason why that is not working properly is because we forgot to, in the configure section of our receive request, we forgot to check off requires reply. So check off requires reply, and now you can see we have a receive request here and we have a nice green checkbox. That's good. So now we just need to go to our map inputs, and we are going to go and map all of the stuff that we just mapped in our outputs to our inputs, and we will do, and we also need to make sure we have the predefined headers checked off. And all right, content length goes to content length, content type goes to content type, response body goes to body here, and response code goes to response code, and response message goes to response message. Okay, so now we have a little bit more complicated orchestration. You can see that we have some data from the receive request that we need to map to the put request, but then the outputs from the put request are pretty much the same as the one from the get request. But now we have two orchestrations in our project here. So we're going to export the second orchestration as well, or we're going to export both orchestrations now. And we're going to import again into Cast Iron Live. So I'm going to actually stop this and delete it, and then re-import it again. And of course we have to eject it and then delete it. Okay, and then we're going to upload it again. So browse and upload to the car. So now, if we look here, we have the two orchestrations that we've created, one for the get, one for the put. I should probably name these better so we can tell what they do. And then we'll click play. And this will deploy both orchestrations. So once these are now running, you can go back to Bluemix and start using these orchestrations from your public cloud applications. But we'll save that for the next video. Thanks for watching.